Welcome to Spooken Softly, where darkness breathes and shadows whisper. I'm your host, and tonight we venture somewhere you may not return from unchanged. Find a quiet place, turn down the lights, and let the story find you. Tonight's episode, The Blue Hour Repair Shop. The smell of Blackwood Cove always settled in the back of the throat like damp copper and rotting kelp. It was a dying coastal town, perched on the edge of a gray, flat sea that never seemed to behave the way water should. The tide here didn't crash, it retreated. Every afternoon, the ocean crawled miles away from the shore, leaving behind vast, glistening plains of black mud, jagged ribs of forgotten shipwrecks, and an empty, echoing silence. My grandmother, Clara, had spent 50 years listening to that silence from behind the counter of her clock repair shop. When she died, she left the shop to me, along with a mountain of brass gears, the scent of lavender oil, and a crushing weight of unfinished business. I still have her last voicemail saved on my phone, though I have never possessed the courage to play it. The timestamp is Tuesday, 4:14 p.m. I was too busy adjusting the escapement wheel of an antique French carriage clock to answer her call, telling myself I would simply call her back tomorrow. There was no tomorrow. She passed away in her sleep that night, leaving me with a hollow, aching void in my chest and a knot of guilt that grew tighter with every passing second. I took over the shop, not out of love for the trade, but because the constant, rhythmic ticking of 100 clocks was the only thing loud enough to drown out the screaming of my own regret. For the first few weeks, I did nothing but clean. The shop was a labyrinth of shadows, its walls lined with mahogany grandfather clocks, delicate pocket watches, and bizarre, unlabeled brass instruments that Clara had collected over her long life. It was while I was cleaning the false bottom of her heavy oak workbench that I found it. Tucked inside a velvet-lined pocket was a silver watch. It was heavier than it looked, its casing cold enough to bite at my fingertips. The white enamel face had no numbers, only 12 thin radial lines that stretched outward like skeletal fingers reaching for the edge. I wound the crown, but the gears inside remained utterly motionless. The watch was dead. I set the silver watch on the counter and went about my work, trying to ignore the way the daylight was beginning to bleed from the sky. It was late afternoon, that quiet transitional moment the locals called the Blue Hour. The sun had dipped below the jagged cliffs of the cove, leaving behind a deep, bruised indigo light that poured through the shop window, painting the brass gears in shades of cold violet. It was my favorite time of day because the town always went completely still. Suddenly, a sound broke the quiet. It was a deep, resonant tick. I froze. The silver watch on the counter was running. The second hand, a thin sliver of black steel, was sweeping smoothly across the enamel face, tracing the skeletal lines with perfect mechanical precision. But as I picked it up, a strange sensation washed over me, like a sudden drop in air pressure that made my ears pop. I looked out the front window of the shop, expecting to see the usual evening traffic, the few remaining fishermen heading home, or the flickering yellow of the street lamps turning on. There was nothing. The street lamp outside was dark, its bulb cold. A flock of seagulls, captured mid-flight over the pier, hung entirely suspended in the air, their wings spread wide, frozen like painted figurines against the violet sky. Down on the road, an old Ford truck sat motionless, a plume of exhaust trapped in a solid, cloud-like shape behind its tailpipe. I pushed the shop door open. The heavy brass bell above the frame did not ring. It remained perfectly silent. The wind had ceased to exist. The air tasted of ancient salt and frozen copper, completely static. The entire town was empty, breathless, and absolutely still. I stepped onto the wooden boardwalk, my boots making no sound against the timber. It was terrifying, yes, but as I walked through the frozen street, a strange, intoxicating sense of relief washed over me. In this quiet, suspended world, the constant, scraping friction of my grief seemed to vanish. The guilt of that missed phone call couldn't reach me here because time itself had stopped. I was entirely alone, wrapped in a blanket of beautiful, sapphire silence. I walked down to the edge of the pier, staring out at the vast, dry mud flats where the tide had retreated. The ocean was gone, leaving only black, glistening silt that stretched to the horizon. I stood there for what felt like hours, simply breathing, until I noticed the silver watch was nearing the 12th line on its face. Fearing what might happen if the hour ended while I was out, I ran back to the shop, set the watch on the counter, and pulled the winding crown out. The instant the ticking stopped, the real world slammed back into my senses with the force of a physical blow. The brass bell above the door chimed loudly. The wind rushed past my face, carrying the scent of low tide, and the frozen seagulls broke their static pose, crying out as they soared into the gathering darkness. The street lamp flickered to life, casting a harsh, yellow glare across the floorboards. I was back. My chest heaved as I gasped for air, my heart hammering against my ribs. But all I could think about was how desperately I wanted to go back. The blue hour became my sanctuary. Every evening, as the sun dipped below the cliffs and the violet light began to pool in the corners of the room, I would wind the silver watch. I actively chose to plunge myself into that frozen, silent world, using those extra stolen minutes to escape the suffocating weight of my reality. I would sit at Clara's workbench, writing letters I would never send, or simply staring out the window at the motionless town. It was a perfect, painless void. But by the fourth night, I realized the silence was no longer absolute. I was sitting on the wooden steps of the pier, looking out over the dark valleys of the exposed seafloor, when I heard it. It was a low, wet, dragging sound, echoing from the deep mudflats below. I scrambled to my feet, my eyes scanning the twilight. The world around me was supposed to be dead, yet the sound had been unmistakably real. It was a slow, heavy slide, like something massive and soft pulling itself over the wet silt. I strained my ears, holding my breath, hoping it was just an illusion of my grieving mind. Then, another sound drifted up from the darkness of the empty bay. It was a rhythmic, organic clicking. It sounded like teeth, dozens of teeth, snapping together in a slow, deliberate tempo that perfectly matched the ticking of the silver watch in my hand. Click, click, click. My blood ran cold. The sound wasn't mechanical. It was wet, hungry, and impossibly close. I didn't look down into the mudflats. I turned and sprinted back to the shop, my legs heavy, my lungs burning in the static air. I slammed the shop door behind me and frantically pulled the crown of the watch. The world rushed back in a chaotic wave of wind and crashing waves, but even as the street lamps flickered on, I could swear I heard the faint, fading echo of that organic clicking just outside the glass. The next morning, the physical world felt different. The air in the shop was heavy, smelling less of old paper and brass and more of deep ocean decay. I was sitting at the counter, my fingers trembling as I tried to clean a clock spring when the door opened. Mr. Harrison, a local fisherman whose face had been carved by decades of salt and wind, stepped into the shop. He was carrying a wooden marine chronometer, but his eyes weren't on his clock. They were on me.
You look like a ghost, Elena. You've got the same hollow look Clara had before she went.
I forced a tight, artificial smile, wiping my grease-stained hands on my apron. I'm just not sleeping well, Mr. Harrison. The tide, it seems louder lately. Harrison set the chronometer on the counter, his eyes darting toward the window where the gray sea was already beginning its daily retreat.
It's not just louder. It's wrong. The tide went out 5 miles today. Never seen the mudflats empty like this. Some of the boys say the water's running away from something, like the sea is holding its breath.
He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper.
Clara used to talk about the blue hour. She said there are things that live in the gaps between the minutes, things that get caught when the tide goes out too far. Don't go looking for them, girl.
After Harrison left, his words hung in the air like heavy smoke. I knew I should lock the silver watch in the safe. I knew I should walk away from the blue hour before whatever was clicking in the mud found its way to me. But as the afternoon faded, the grief returned, sharper and more painful than before, whispering that the frozen quiet was the only place I could ever find peace. I was an addict, and the watch was my drug. When the twilight fell, I wound the crown. The heavy tick returned, and the world died. The wind stopped, the seagulls froze. This time, I did not leave the shop. I locked the front door and stood behind the thick glass of the window, staring out into the empty street. The bruised indigo light seemed darker tonight, casting long, distorted shadows that stretched toward the harbor. And then I saw it. Standing under the unlit street lamp at the end of the boardwalk was a silhouette. It was tall, impossibly thin, its proportions entirely wrong. Its arms hung low, the dark shapes of its hands brushing against its knees. It stood perfectly still, facing the shop, its head tilted at an unnatural, broken angle. I blinked, my heart seizing. In the fraction of a second my eyes were closed, the figure moved. It was now 20 feet closer, standing at the edge of the wooden pier. I could see the texture of its shape now. It didn't look like skin, but rather a shifting, wet mass of black silt and kelp, clinging to a skeletal frame that clicked as it shifted. Elena. The voice didn't come from outside. It vibrated through the glass of the window, through the floorboards beneath my feet, echoing inside my own skull. It was Clara's voice, but it was stretched, warped, and played at a sickeningly slow speed, like a vinyl record dragging under a heavy thumb. Elena, why didn't you answer me? The sheer terror of the sound broke my paralysis. I grabbed the silver watch from the counter, my fingers slick with cold sweat, and yanked the winding crown out. The blue light shattered, the real world rushed back, and the figure vanished. But the window pane in front of me was covered in a thick, cold film of gray mud, and the smell of rotting salt filled the shop. I couldn't do it anymore. The dread was a physical weight, pressing down on my chest until I could barely breathe. I took the silver watch, wrapped it in a heavy canvas cloth, and locked it inside the iron cash box beneath the counter. I promised myself I would never touch it again. I would face the grief. I would listen to Clara's last voicemail. I would let the real world, with all its pain and noise, wash over me. But the universe, it seemed, had other plans. The next afternoon, the tide did not just retreat, it vanished. By 4 o'clock, the ocean was nothing but a thin, dark line on the absolute horizon, leaving the entire bay completely dry. The townspeople gathered at the edge of the pier, their voices a low, panicked murmur as they stared out at the miles of exposed, rotting seafloor. The air was hot, static, and smelled of dying things. I sat inside the shop, the doors locked, my hands pressed over my ears to drown out the ticking of the 100 clocks on the walls. I wanted them to stop. I wanted everything to stop. As the sun began to touch the jagged cliffs, a sudden, suffocating silence fell over the room. I opened my eyes. The ticking of the grandfather clocks had not stopped, but they were growing faint, their brass pendulums moving slower and slower, like they were swinging through thick syrup. Inside the locked iron cash box beneath the counter, a new sound began. Thunk-tick. Thunk-tick. The silver watch was running on its own. I backed away, my chest heaving, my eyes wide with horror as the blue light began to spill through the windows. It was thicker tonight, a deep, oily violet that seemed to swallow the light rather than reflect it. The murmuring of the crowds outside vanished. The wind died. The heavy, dead silence of the blue hour dropped over Blackwood Cove like an iron coffin lid. I didn't wind it. I didn't want this. Outside, on the wooden boardwalk, came a sound. Squelch, tap, squelch, tap. It was the wet, dragging slide of something heavy, accompanied by the sharp, metallic tap of a bone-thin limb. It was moving toward the shop door. I scrambled backward, my boots slipping on the floorboards, until my back hit the heavy oak of Clara's workbench. I looked at the iron cash box. The metal was frost white, ice forming over the keyhole as the ticking inside grew louder, faster, a frantic, rattling rhythm that vibrated through the floor. The door handle began to turn. It rotated slowly, the brass screaming in the silence, though no sound came from the hinges. The wood of the door began to groan under an immense, wet pressure, buckling inward as if the weight of the entire dry ocean was pressing against it. I tried to scream, but the static air swallowed my voice, leaving nothing but a dry gasp in my throat. The entity was not just at the door. Squelch, tap, squelch, tap. The footsteps were inside. They were walking across the ceiling. I looked up. In the corners of the room, the shadows were pooling, thickening into a dark, wet grease that dripped onto the floorboards without a sound. The ceiling was warping, bending downward as if something massive was crawling through the plaster. And then the whispers began. They came from every corner of the shop, a discordant, overlapping chorus of voices. I heard Clara's voice, slow and warped. I heard Mr. Harrison's voice, panicked and sharp. And then I heard my own voice, speaking words I had never said. "I'm sorry I didn't answer. I'm sorry. The water is gone. We are waiting in the mud. Let us in. Let us in." A shape began to detach itself from the ceiling. It descended slowly, a tangle of long, jointed limbs that clicked and shifted like the internal escapement of a grandfather clock. It had no face, only a pale, wet mask of gray silt, with two dark, hollow voids where eyes should have been. Its body was a mass of rotting kelp and cold copper gears spinning slowly within its ribcage. It stretched its long, skeletal hand toward me. The fingers were wet, dripping with black mud that smelled of ancient dead seas. I realized then that it hadn't been waiting for me to enter its world. It had been using my grief, my active choices, to learn the shape of mine. It had been creeping closer with every tick of the watch, and now the transition was almost complete. I had to stop the watch. I scrambled toward the counter, but the air was like solid glass, resisting my every movement. The entity clicked, its skeletal limbs snapping together as it drifted closer, its icy breath washing over my face. It smelled of old copper and rotting salt. I reached the cash box. The iron was so cold it tore the skin from my fingertips as I grabbed the key, but I didn't feel the pain. I unlocked it, throwing the lid back. The silver watch lay inside, its face glowing with a faint, malevolent blue light. The second hand was spinning frantically, a blur of black steel. The entity's hand closed around my wrist. The cold was absolute. My arm went entirely numb, the skin turning a bruised violet gray as the frost spread up my forearm. The pain was a blinding, white-hot scream inside my head, but I forced my other hand forward, grabbing a pair of heavy brass pliers from the workbench. The entity's face, that blank, wet void of silt, was inches from mine. Its mouth opened, a dark, gaping crevice filled with rows of needle-thin organic gears that spun and clicked. Elena, join the hour. With a final desperate scream of agony, I jammed the pliers into the silver watch, gripping the winding crown, and twisted with all my remaining strength. The winding stem sheared off in the metal jaws of the pliers. The ticking stopped. The blue light shattered like glass. Instantly, the world slammed back into my senses. The heavy brass bell above the door chimed in a frantic frenzy. The sound of the wind returned, howling through the streets, carrying the roar of a sudden, violent tide rushing back into the cove. The street lamps flickered on, filling the shop with a harsh yellow light that burned my eyes. I collapsed onto the floor, gasping for air, my chest heaving as I clutched my frozen, bruised arm. The shop was empty. The ceiling was solid plaster. The door was locked, undamaged. The entity was gone. I lay there for a long time, listening to the beautiful, chaotic noise of the real world. The wind, the crashing waves, the distant voices of the townspeople down at the harbor. I had won. I had broken the watch. I had escaped. But as I finally stood up, rubbing my numb, aching wrist, I looked out the window. The tide had returned, but it was too high. The dark gray water was lapping against the very edge of the wooden boardwalk, black and silent under the street lamps. It was as if the sea had crawled closer to the shop, waiting. And then, as I held my breath in the quiet shop, I heard a sound. It wasn't coming from the clocks on the walls. It wasn't coming from the broken silver watch on the counter. It was coming from inside my own chest. Thunk, tick, thunk, tick. A slow, heavy, organic clicking, perfectly keeping time against the beating of my heart. And so ends tonight's tale, The Blue Hour Repair Shop. Thank you for sitting with us in the dark. If the shadows spoke to you tonight, subscribe to Spooken Softly and stay close. There are more stories waiting, more voices in the walls, more things that go quiet just before you notice them. Until next time, sleep well, if you can.